What makes the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church so unique? Why is it such a remarkable attempt to bridge the divide between Eastern and Western Christianity? How can its history help us better understand the history of Europe and of the Christian religion? How has it shaped Ukrainian national identity? And how did it survive the Soviet era when the authorities sought to eradicate it? You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld, an English-language media platform about Ukraine, run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Natalia Shlikhta, a well-known Ukrainian historian and professor at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. This episode is produced in partnership with the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. Before we begin, a quick reminder, you can support UkraineWorld on Patreon. We rely on crowdfunding to sustain our work. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to Ukraine's frontline regions, where we support both civilians and soldiers by providing mostly vehicles for soldiers and books for civilians. Donations are welcome via PayPal. All relevant links are available in the episode description. So let's begin. Pani Natalia, welcome to this podcast.
Yeah, I'm happy. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much for agreeing to talk. We are now in your room in Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. I'm very happy to be at History Department. It's a great pleasure, a great honor.
You're welcome.
And we decided to talk about the Greek Catholic Church. And let me just explain to you why I'm interested in this question. Because I'm a philosopher, I'm not a historian. But for me, a Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is one of the unique global phenomenon because it is one of the very rare example of, bringing back the Eastern and Western Christianity. And it is also one of the rare examples how Ukrainian experience shows the dialogue between the so-called two Romes, the Rome as a Rome and what is sometimes called the Second Rome, Constantinople. How would you describe the kind of a global phenomenon of Greek Catholic Church?
Thank you for this philosophical question. Actually, it's difficult for a historian to talk about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in such terms, but it's interesting that you've mentioned this idea of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church being a kind of a part of a global phenomenon, and actually it's interesting that the head of the church, Metropolitan Sviatoslav Shevchuk, has recently described his church, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, as a global church. So he mentioned that paradoxically, this church is, on the one hand, is a national church of Ukrainian people, and actually it aspires to present itself as being a national church, but on the other hand, it's a global church. So it's a part of the universal church, but it's also a representative of this global search for the unity of Christianity, if I may define it like this. And actually, when we turn our attention to how the Ukrainian Greek Catholic confessional historiography describes this church, so this would be one of the most important identification factors for their church, because they stress this idea of the church that managed to even though it was very difficult, even though the historical developments were very complex with many conflicts and everything like this, but this church managed to achieve this unity that the Christian church has lost after the split between the Eastern and Western churches back in the 11th century. And while bringing together these two churches, while bringing together, it also brought together traditions, both Eastern traditions and traditions of Eastern Christianity and traditions of Western Christianity, and this very important for the self-presentation and self-identification of this church.
I fully agree with this assessment. I think this makes a huge difference towards the Russian religious tradition, which was very anti-Catholic and anti-Protestant.
Yeah, exactly.
There are different trends, of course, but when I look, for example, at the Russian religious Orthodox philosophy of the 19th century, early 20th century, in many aspects, of course, with some exemptions, but in many aspects it was kind of a criticizing not only Catholic Church as such, but also Catholic dogmatics, Catholic theology, whereas the Ukrainian case shows that it is possible. It is possible to be two churches in one.
Yeah.
Let us talk a little bit about Ukrainian identity. So you basically mentioned that Greek Catholic Church is both global and national, but I find that its story with regard to Ukrainian national identity is very, very interesting because it's not linear. It's not one-sided. Because if we take the church union back then in the Baroque times, early modern times, 16th century, for many Ukrainian Orthodox theologians, intellectuals, simple people, it was kind of a hostile event, and there is lots of hostility with regard to this union church. And then we see how it gradually emerges into kind of a pivot of Ukrainian national identity. I'm very interested when you see that, probably in the 19th century, in the Habsburg monarchy, probably in some other time, and of course during the Soviet period. It's also very important. What is your story about this?
Thanks. That's an incredibly interesting and complex question. And I would start with a brief but very important terminological remark. So you've mentioned when when you were asking this question, you've mentioned the term Uniat Church, yeah? And so that's a very complex term for the definition of this church, and actually it's preferable among historians not to use this term as with regards to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, because during the Soviet times this church so it was during the Russian imperial times and afterwards during the Soviet times when this term uniats, uniate, упорствующие uniate, stubborn uniats. So it acquired such a negative connotation that when you are using the term uniat, that it means that as if you share this negative view of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And for instance, as regards the terminology, so it's a commonplace now in the historiography that we define this church as not uniatska, but unina, which is a Ukrainian very specific term for this uniat, yeah, unina cerkva, and this term is applicable to the developments within this church up until the late 18th century, when the present name of this church was actually so it was Empress Maria Theresa who defined this church as a Greek Catholic Church. So, and this was the birth of the present day name of this church. So that's terminological issue. And as regards the history, I would say very briefly, so many volumes of studies are written on this complex history. But to be brief, we would mention first this Baroque time, early modern period, Reformation and Counter-Reformation period. If you remember, so these ideas to achieve, to return and to the unity of the Christian church. So these ideas were at the ear starting from the 13th century, actually, 13th, 14th, 15th century, and there were a number of councils organized by the papacy in order to bring divided Christians to the unity. So all these councils failed, but it's interesting that Ukrainian hierarchs, and here the contrast with the hierarchy from the Moscow, from the Duchy of Moscow, would be very important. So the Ukrainian hierarchs, Orthodox hierarchs, were very active participants of all these councils, and especially of the Council of Florence that developed this idea of the unity of the Western and Christian churches. So these openers among the highest hierarchy of the church. The second context would be the context of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the context of the Counter-Reformation, because in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Orthodox population and the Orthodox Church was, let's say, in the suppressed position, and especially after the Council of Trident in the late 16th century. So to add, to make the story even more complex, that was just the period of the crisis of the Eastern Christianity and the crisis of Orthodoxy after the fall of the Second Rome, after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So that's the context, and that's and here we should look for the ideas behind that moved the hierarchy, the representatives of the hierarchy, Ukrainian Orthodox hierarchy, towards these Uniat ideas and towards the decisions of the Council of Brest of 1596. But you are completely right. When this new church was born, Unijna Cerkva, this church actually, it seemed, especially during the first 2 centuries, I would say, almost 2 centuries of its existence, it seems that this project, if we can apply this term to such important religious things, so it seemed that this project was a complete disaster and complete failure, because actually it had no it had no response amongst Ukrainian population at all. So these were hierarchy, these were some Orthodox priests who supported this idea, but not Ukrainian aristocracy and not Ukrainian common population, common people. So for common people, something that was very much important, and here we would mention something which is a very characteristic feature of intrinsic feature, I would say, of any religion, and this religion is a tradition. And actually, a French sociologist, if I'm not wrong, Daniela Vieux-Laguerre, she defines religion as a chain of memory, as a chain of tradition, as a bureau of tradition. And everything that goes against that tradition, traditional patterns of life, of daily life, this is something that would not be accepted by religious people. And that's very interesting because this a very recurrent process in history back in the 16th century and 17th century, these people didn't want to accept the Unia. During the Russian imperial times and especially during the Soviet times, these people didn't want to return to the Mother Orthodox Church because it meant the breaking of their daily routine, basically. So that was one important thing. Another thing was that actually there were hopes by the Orthodox hierarchy and clergy that once they become uniate, which meant what it meant. It meant the change of the subordination from Constantinople to Rome, and it meant the acceptance of some important dogmatical things of which common people were just ignorant, completely remained ignorant, and it meant the preservation of the so-called indigenous Eastern rite. So ritual life, it had to remain almost untouched. So it was the idea of this Unia Church. And the hope among these people who promoted this Uniate idea was that it would raise their social status and they would receive the equal rights with Catholic clergy, and so their status would be different from that of oppressed Orthodox hierarchy. So it wasn't like that. So everything remained as it was before. And as regards the position of the Vatican and of the Catholic Church in Poland, for them, the Uniate Church that was criticized as being an instrument of Polonization and of turning to the Roman Catholicism. So for them, the Uniate Church was a barrier to to Polonization and barrier to the true conversion to the Catholicism, to the Catholic Church. And as a result, it seemed to be a complete failure. And as you know, the Ukrainian Cossacks who developed in the course of the 17th century, developed into a kind of the Ukrainian elite and representatives of Ukrainian, so self-proclaimed and recognized representatives of Ukrainian Orthodox people. So they fought for the true Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And the term of the Orthodox Church, of the Cossack faith as an Orthodox faith would be a common place, for instance, within the texts in the 19th and 20th century. That's very interesting. And they were fighting against Poles and against Catholics and also against Uniates. So the first 2 centuries were like this, and I would say that this change you were asking about, how the church emerged as a national church out of all these complexities. So this change was due to geopolitical changes, actually, because in the late 18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ceased to exist as a result of the 3 partitions of the state, and actually Ukrainian lands and Belarusian also lands of this state were divided between three empires, but for us, Ukrainian lands, so they were within the Habsburg monarchy and the Romanos Empire. And this gave the chance for this church. First of all, because when we are talking about the Russian state, the Russian Empire, you've already mentioned this hostility to everything Western, everything Polish, everything Catholic, everything. So this idea that was born back in the 18th century, but especially developed within the 19th century and culminated in this famous triad of the Minister of Prosvещения, Uvarov, in 1833, which made this identification of Russian, people, which means Russian people, orthodoxy, and Russian orthocracy. And it meant, so this unity, this triad meant that everything that was hostile or was regarded hostile to the orthodoxy was hostile to true Orthodox people and to Russian autocracy. And even much earlier, when Ivan Grozny and his father started this, developed this idea of Moscow at the Third Rome, after the fall of Constantinople, and this idea of gathering of Russian lands, собирание земель русских. So it meant that they took on themselves this task of fighting against everything that was not Orthodox. And actually this Unina Tserkva, it ceased to exist in the Russian Empire. And it was a paradox, because when we are coming to the Habsburg part of Ukrainian territory, so these are present day here West Ukrainian regions, this idea that the actually Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is a regional church, is a West Ukrainian church, but when we are defining this church like this, we forget that actually Lvivska, Ternopilska, present-day Ivano-Frankivska Oblast, Peremyska Oblast, they were the last to sign for Unia, to accept the Unia. So they remain Orthodox dioceses up until the early 18th century. So that's very interesting, but now they were part of the new empire, and that empire was based on a completely different principles that the Romanovs Empire was based on, even though, for instance, Maria Theresa, she shared Enlightenment ideas of the development of building the state, just like Russian emperors Peter I and Catherine II, but the understanding was completely different. And for Maria Theresa and for Emperor Joseph II, the idea was to make the Habsburg monarchy to work as a perfect bureaucratic state. And within this perfect bureaucratic state, they didn't want any opponents or any counter-forcers, while the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, was this alternative origin of power, source of power within the Habsburg monarchy. So for Maria Theresa and for her son, the basic idea was to lower the status of the Roman Catholic Church and also to make some actually problems, if I may say, for Poles who were the dominant population in Galicia, and who, because everyone, when we are just talking about Poles, we are thinking about the constant uprising, the ideas to reestablish the golden age of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So for them, it was important somehow to do something with these irredentist movements by Poles, and one of the instruments to do this was to raise the status of the Unina Church. So in 1774, Maria Theresa proclaimed something that was very much important. She said, from now on, these two churches are equal. There's no Uniat Church. There are two Catholic Church, one Greek Catholic because of the rite, and another Roman Catholic. And they would have the same social status. They would have the same access to education. So the Greek Catholic clergy received access to theological schools, Catholic theological schools. Later on, theological seminaries were established for Greek Catholic clergy, and even at the beginning of the 20th century, the Theological Academy was established in Lviv by Metropolitan Andrei Sheptetsky. So that was the very high level of theological education. It was access to secular education, and it was also the support by the state of the clergy of this church. So they supported it financially, and they, for instance, even paid pensions for the clergy and for widows and for children, etc. So that was a tremendous change of status on the one hand, but on the other hand, if we just imagine the so-called Eastern Galicia in the Habsburg monarchy, and the almost mainly rural area, and actually with only few towns, cities to be developed in the course of the 19th century. And now Ukrainian elite or Galician elite, there was this Polish joke saying that this Ukrainian Galician population are chlopi i popi, so they are just these common people, and they are priests. So so priests were very close to their people, and this mix of all these changes led to that. In the 19th century, which is commonly regarded and defined as a period of nation building. So these were Greek Catholic priests who became these social actors, who became promoters of the nation building Ukrainian national building in Galicia, because first of all, that was the matter of the education. They were established, they were writing grammar books, they were writing newspapers, they were establishing Sunday schools, etc., etc., etc. They were very much active within the economic, social, cooperative movement. So all these things that actually were part of the Risorgimento in the 19th century in any country. So in Galicia, Ukrainian Galicia, these were Greek Catholic clergy who were doing this. and the reason was there was no other elite, there was no secular elite, and it was only at the very end of the 19th century when the secular elite took the lead within this process. But in the course of the long 19th century, that was the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church that was doing this day-to-day job. And here, one important name to be mentioned here would be the name of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptetsky, who was the head of this church for many, many years, almost half a century, and it was just recently, I didn't know this definition by the people of the head of the church, and this definition is etnarch, which means that he is the father, not only the formal ruler of the church, not only the true leader of the church, but as a leader of nation, or a person who unites the nation. This a very important definition, and it's a very important recognition of this person's input into first change of the status of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and second of the play of the role of this church within the Galicia, within the Ukrainian Galicia in the Habsburg, and later on in the Second Polish Republic. And here just one more thing, because I just told at the very beginning that's a very complex and long story. It's difficult to tell it very briefly, so I'm sorry for this long story, but it was like that. Something which is very important, this his turning of the church into an important social actor being engaged in the economic activities, supporting these economic activities, cooperatives that I've already mentioned, and also cultural activities of the people. So that's something. We've already mentioned this present-day definition by Metropolitan Sviatoslav Shevchuk of this church being a national church being a global church, and here is the third but equally important component of this self-definition, the church being an active social actor, being a part of the Ukrainian громадянське суспільство. Civil society. So he had a very nice definition saying that the church serves no power, it serves people and their need, and it's an integral part of Ukrainian civil society. So this the third cornerstone of the identity of the present-day Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And as regards these repressions of the Soviet times, you might ask a specific question because I
will ask about this. Yeah. But first, let me. It's amazing story, very very interesting, very complex story. I would add a few also philosophical reflections on this because it's very interesting. So the paradox of this church is that it was an idea which was kind of simultaneous to the idea of Catholic expansion. And what you mentioned, Counter-Reformation, this idea of triumphant church, which basically was an idea of Catholic expansion against the Protestants, against the Lutherans. And then in our part of the world, it was expansion against the Orthodox. And of course, it produced kind of a counterattack from the Orthodox, and therefore we have lots of this polemic literature, etc. And what you mentioned, by many Orthodox people, it was perceived as a threat, as Polonization or Latinization threat. Although even in the Ukrainian Orthodoxy, and we are now in the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, and I think Kyiv-Mohyla Academy is part of this very interesting process when Orthodox religion responds to Catholics in Latin, using Latin language, using Latin instruments of debate. But then, for this Orthodox, Moscow still doesn't exist as a kind of this alternative pole. They're still thinking in terms of, well, yes, Constantinople has fallen, but maybe Kyiv will take this role, right? And they were still thinking in these terms. And it's very interesting that you mentioned that when Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was divided, and then part of it, which was later known as Galicia, was part of a Habsburg monarchy, and therefore it created this possibility of Greek Catholic Church. We didn't happen in Belarus, for example, the Belarusian lands.
Yeah.
And probably this is the reason why Belarus suffered from the Russification much more and didn't have this instrument of the counterattack.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting that in this idea of the Third Rome that was developed in early 16th century in Muscovy, there is this idea that I always find very problematic, is that not only that Moscow is the Third Rome, but that the first two Romes have fallen. Which was of course not the case. And Rome existed as a city, it still exists, a wonderful city. Roman Church existed at the time. And we see that now, interestingly, when Ukrainian Orthodox Church got its tomos and basically became an autonomous church from the Russian Church, it realigned itself with Constantinople. So there are very interesting topics to discuss, but we just come closer to the Soviet times. And that's very, very interesting and an important topic. I've listened to one of your interviews to Lokalna Historia, where you said very interestingly how Stalin, when he was kind of rejecting the Lenin's attack on the Russian Orthodox Church and was trying to rebuild the empire. And I totally agree with you how he was rebuilding a Russian empire, actually. But what you say, it's very interesting that he was also rebuilding Russian Orthodox Church. And when, during the Second World War, Soviet Union invaded Poland, and that means annexed those lands, including Galicia. And then after the end of the Second World War, it was an attempt of waging the war against Greek Catholics, including the religious war from the kind of a Russian Orthodox perspective against these Greek Catholics. You mentioned Andrei Sheptytsky. He was dead in 1944. So after the end of the Second World War, basically, this big figure disappeared. How can you describe this process?
Thanks. Yeah, that's an important question. Just a brief remark to your to something that you've mentioned, that this Ukrainian Orthodox hierarchy and Ukrainian Orthodox elite that was fighting and polemicized with the Uniats, it did not mean automatically that they were looking or searching for an ideal somewhere at Moscow. You are completely right. And I would just add this idea of Kyiv as the second Jerusalem that was developed here in this on this territory in the 17th century, and we can remember the name of Petro Mohyla, the founder of this university, which is very important here. But now to the Soviet times, and you just I won't repeat something that you've already mentioned, the Stalin's ideas or the Stalin's motivation, let us say, for the destruction of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. I would just add that the motivation was both this national and also it was religious, because we must remember that the Soviet state was an anti-religious state. It was there were changes in the attitude towards religion during the long Soviet period, but still it was a state fighting all religions, just because its own idea was to develop its own new religion, which was, scholars apply the concepts of political religions, religion, when they are talking about the ideology, the role of the ideology in the Soviet state. So these two reasons, anti-religious and anti-national, anti-Ukrainian, were the reasons for fighting, for waging this war against the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. So, and here just we can just say the story very briefly without many complexities. So there was the formal dissolution of this church in this state. So this church ceased to officially exist in this state as a result of the so-called Council of Lviv taking place in March 1946. And it's so interesting, just a recent monograph by Lviv colleague Roman Skakun on the infiltration of KGB, of using the hierarchy as KGB agents. And he pays special attention to this Lviv Council and the whole story of this being an KGB action. So it formally ceased to exist, and the revival of the legalization of this church in the Soviet state took place only within the context of Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost in the late 1980s, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And when we are talking about the Soviet period, so this church, so whether it disappeared, I think the answer, so this not a correct answer, and the correct question, or the answer would be not, it disappeared. And when the majority of people are thinking about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church over this period, they are thinking about the Catechism Church. Yes, that's the largest catechism church in Eastern Europe. That's the Church of Silence as defined by Pope Paul VI, and lots of people many people being ready to suffer persecutions, to go through the Gulag system just to preserve their faith, because they perceive the conversion to Orthodoxy that was demanded from them by the regime as the betrayal of the church and the betrayal of Christ. And here is almost exact quotation of one underground priest. But the majority of these people, the majority of clergy, they still, so there was this official term, reunited. So they became official part of the Russian Orthodox Church. And the largest part of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church existed in this condition of they lived through this Soviet period within the formal structure of the Russian Orthodox Church. And here it's an incredibly interesting story, and because we might say that actually these people betrayed their faith and they all became Orthodox, and it would be a very simplistic answer, just very far from reality, because in their majority, these people retained their traditions. These people, they didn't change. You remember we were talking at the very beginning how it's very difficult for these religious people to change the traditional patterns of their life. So they didn't change. They retained their Ukraineness, their Ukrainian identity, so they didn't accept this both confessional Orthodox identity and this I would say, Russian identity, because the Russian Orthodox Church, it's not by accident that in the title of the church we see this Russian component being the first just before the Orthodox Church, even though in the 19th century it was vice versa. So they didn't accept the imposed identity, they retained their traditions, they remained Ukrainian, and even more, they had a very important impact upon the rest of the Orthodox Church within the borders of the Ukrainian Republic. And just to finish up, I would say that when we are talking about the existence of this church through the Soviet period, when it was officially non-existent, we have this part of the Catacomb Church preserving the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, preserving the hierarchy of the church. But on the other hand, we have this phenomenon which I defined as a church within the church, because even though being formally part of the Russian Orthodox Church, these people remained separate, retained the otherness, and they preserved actually these formal structures, these churches that were officially declared Orthodox, etc., etc. And these two parts merged together, even though it was very much problematic in the late 1980s and 1990s during the religious renaissance of this period and during the revival of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, but still they merged together, and thanks to this both modes of survival, I would say, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church preserved itself through this period of repressions. And I would say that the present day identity and present day portrait of this church, it's not only as it's based not only on the legacy of the Catacomb Church, but also on the legacy of the church within the church. So just example, so Metropolitan Sviatoslav Shevchuk and his teacher, his beloved teacher, so the person who prepared him for serving within the Catholic Church, was a reunited priest. So was a reunited priest who was a formally Orthodox priest. So that's something that we should remember.
That's very interesting, and really it shows also the way how Ukrainian identity preserves itself even in the situation when the conditions are very bad for it. Unfortunately, we need to finish on this, and it's an incredible story, and thank you very much for helping us to unpack it. You see that how this one of the key elements of the Ukrainian current identity is so much enrooted in very difficult global process, but also how its destiny is really not linear, and very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me, for asking me to talk about this, to think about this, and to try just for myself to uncover all these complexities. Thank you.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, an English language media platform about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Natalia Shlikhta, a well-known Ukrainian historian and professor at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And our conversation was about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. This episode is produced in partnership with the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the Heritage Ukraine project, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. Let me remind you that you can support our work, UkraineWorld, and this podcast on Patreon. We rely on crowdfunding to sustain our work. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to Ukraine's frontline areas where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. All relevant links are available in the episode description. Thank you for listening, stay with us, and stand with Ukraine.